Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. The classical Athenians had a curious habit of honoring, after the fact, the very citizens that they had once condemned to death, whether directly or indirectly. Socrates, of course, is the most famous case, but there's another less remembered instance, Demosthenes. He was Athens' greatest orator, one of its most polarizing figures, and, like Socrates, he was someone who insisted that he'd spent his life trying to do what he thought was best for his city. And yet, among classicists today, Demosthenes might be the Greek author whose reputation most exceeds how much he has actually read. His speech on the Crown still shows up on most PhD reading lists, but it's not a text that's as accessible today as a Homeric poem or Greek tragedy. On the Crown is very inside baseball. It's a culmination of a long career and a long feud with Aeschines, and it's packed with context-specific references and esoteric personal jabs. The Greek is also very hard. Still, even if Demosthenes doesn't get much love from modern readers, his legend does loom large. Already in antiquity, he set the standard for what oratory and eloquence could be. For example, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the historian and critic writing in Rome during the age of Augustus, never missed a chance to gush about him. We should remember, though, that ancient critics didn't usually separate style from substance. If they liked the message, they usually praised the form. By Dionysius' time, Demosthenes' image as the man who tried to save Greece from Macedon was solidified. That was a reputation that Demosthenes had carefully built for himself in his own lifetime, and that later admirers, like Dionysius, happily bought into. To Dionysius' mind, Demosthenes' speeches carried the most admirable sentiments, which meant, of course, that they were written in the finest prose. But back in the 4th century BC in Athens, things had been much less tidy. Demosthenes was a deeply divisive figure. Some saw him as the last true defender of Greek freedom, and that's certainly how he advertised himself. Others blamed him for Greece's fall to Philip of Macedon. Both sides might have had a point. In any case, eventually Athens turned on him. He was accused of corruption, imprisoned, escaped, and finally took his own life as the agents of Antipater, Alexander the Great's successor in Greece, closed in on him. And yet, just a generation later, the Athenians voted to honor him with a bronze statue in the Agora, the same place where traditionally they commemorated those who'd fought and oftentimes died for the city. That reversal, from disgraced politician to civic hero, is at the heart of a new biography written by my guest today, James Romm. James's book, Demosthenes, Democracy's Defender, revisits Athens' most famous orator and looks past the legends to reveal a far more complex and far more human figure. James Romm is an author, reviewer, and the James H. Ottaway Jr. Professor of Classics at Bard College in Annandale, New York. He specializes in ancient Greek and Roman culture and civilization. His reviews and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, The London Review of Books, The Daily Beast, and other venues. He has held the Guggenheim Fellowship from 1999 to 2000, the Birkelund Fellowship at the Dorothy and Lewis B. Cullman Center for Writers and Scholars at the New York Public Library from 2010 to 2011, and a Biography Fellowship at the Leon Levy Center of the City University of New York in 2014 to 15. Just a quick note that, as ever, I have put a few references in the show notes for this episode. Don't forget, too, that Lesche is on Instagram, and that's where I post announcements about new episodes. So if you're on Instagram, you might want to follow the podcast there. We're at Lesche Podcast. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche James Romm. The next voice you'll be hearing is his.
Yale got in touch with me about this series 5 or 6 years ago, and I think they wanted someone who has looked deeply at character in portraits of ancient people, rather than simply at actions and historical context. The difficulty of writing biographies of ancient people is the sources that often don't give us insight into personality, thoughts, emotions, motives, the kinds of things that really make character interesting. But it can be found in some cases if one looks hard enough. the goal of the series, as I conceived it, is to deal with those people for whom an inner life can really be accessed. Not always the big names like Alexander the Great. I think he's the perfect case in point, because although he's fascinating and the story, many people have wanted to know his story, he really can't be known as an individual, as a person with thoughts and feelings. We really don't understand his motives in most cases. So our series has not done Alexander. It's done other figures, some of them much less well known to the public, but people for whom this kind of inner life can be accessed.
And what was it that led you to choose Demosthenes as a subject for a biography in this series?
Again, he's a perfect case in point. We have speeches by him, more than 60. We have a funeral oration he delivered over the dead in a battle that he himself had instigated or organized. We have letters by him sent at a time when he was in exile and pleading for reinstatement. We even have something called the erotic essay, which is about his feelings of passionate love for a younger man. We have an immense amount of material that allows us to really get to know him as a person. And that, to me, is the essence of biography.
Well, you had also, your previous book that you had written was about the Sacred Band of Thebes. And I know you've worked a lot in the 4th century. When you said about writing Demosthenes, had you always thought that you wanted to stay in that particular period? Was there anything from the work on the Sacred Band and on Thebes in particular in the 4th century that led you then over to Demosthenes?
Well, it was more a spin-off from my first trade book, which was called Ghost on the Throne, The Death of Alexander the Great and the War for Crown and Empire, which features Demosthenes as a bit player, as a member of an ensemble cast, but also tells part of his story in the context of the war that followed Alexander's death, the War of the Successors. That story seemed to me to need expansion and investigation. And so I'm picking up a thread that I first dropped about, 15 years ago with Ghost on the Throne.
Well, could you say a little bit about who Demosthenes was? What was his background? Where was he coming from in Athens?
He was born in the 4th century, the early 4th century, a time of Athenian decline after the defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, the loss of the naval empire, and a time when, during Demosthenes' manhood, his adulthood, Macedon increasingly became a threat to Athenian autonomy and power. The Macedonians had never figured largely on the Greek stage. They were bit players, but in the time of Philip, father of Alexander, they suddenly rose to superpower status. And Demosthenes, starting around the time he was 30, in his mid-30s, determined that he was going to try to stop Philip by persuading the Athenians to make war on him.
Both Demosthenes' biographical and autobiographical tradition, if you can call it that, from what we garner from the speeches, it suggests that, in a way, he was not the most likely person, given his background, to rise up to become this opponent of Philip II of Macedon. Could you speak a little bit about the way that his early life is cast in terms of obstacles overcome?
He was not a natural political leader in the Athenian context. He didn't have any military background or experience. He was not ever elected to the office of general, which most of the great leaders of Athens had occupied. He was considered a kind of a weirdo. He was scrawny and sickly, didn't like to go to drinking parties, stayed up all night working on his oratory. And
so he was a nerd.
He was a nerd. He was or perhaps a career politician. That's the phrase that I use in my book. that he had devoted himself from an early age, from his teens, to perfecting the art of oratory and persuading juries first in his court cases and then the Athenian assembly in his political speeches.
And there's a very interesting story about what first led him to compose speeches, for in his own case. Could you just share that with listeners about the question of his inheritance?
So Demosthenes came from a wealthy family. His father owned factories and had amassed a fortune and meant to hand it down to his son, but died when Demosthenes was only 7 and left the estate in the trust of some cousins who, according to the version that we have, which is from Demosthenes, proceeded to plunder it and embezzle from it. Demosthenes, when he reached majority, when he reached 18, was determined to get that money back. So he set himself to perfecting the art of speech-making, partly as his own advocate, to bring suit against his cousins and recover his inheritance. And his first speech, the first surviving speech we have from him, called Against Aphabus, is an indictment of the leader of this band of embezzling cousins had stolen his money.
Well, as someone who spent all this time with those sources, what is your sense of what led Demosthenes to make this leap from composing a speech to advocate on behalf of himself to then eventually moving into politics? And you narrate kind of his debut in the assembly. I mean, how do we account for that leap?
This was quite the usual thing in Athens because speech making and speech writing was the tool of trade, was the path to success in both the legal profession, the law courts, and in the assembly, the town hall meetings, if you like, by which Athenians made all important decisions. There was no legislature per se. The decision-making was by the citizen body at large in a big open-air session. So a speech writer or someone who could persuade by means of words could make a lot of money as a legal defendant, as a legal advocate, but also by accruing influence in the assembly from which flowed bribes and favors and contracts and all the things that we know politicians are very fond of. So the two professions, legal and political, were often combined in the 4th century.
So what was the context of his debut in the assembly, of his first foray into, let's say, policy?
So the first political speech we have from Demosthenes was at a time when Athens was afraid that it was going to be under attack from the Persian Empire, the same power that had invaded and actually sacked Athens more than a century before this. It seemed like the Persian king was amassing a navy, perhaps targeting Athens once again. There was a proposal to declare war on the king, but Demosthenes was not in favor of that, so he spoke against it in his first political speech that we have, but also had a set of proposals for reforming the way the Navy was organized, making it more efficient, making sure that people who were supposed to subsidize warships, this was all done by private donations essentially, would not shirk their duty and cheap out and deprive the Navy of resources. And those proposals seem to have been rejected, but the proposal to scuttle the war with Persia was voted in. So in his first outing, he had a mixed outcome, but was on the right side in terms of foreign policy.
Yeah, having read your book, it occurred to me that, I mean, we know Demosthenes, his name is a sort of byword for this aggressively ideological, anti-Philip policy, very nationalistic in one way. But it seems that he was also someone who really got into the nitty-gritty of the numbers and the logistics. I mean, could you speak a little bit about that? What kind of mind do you think he had when it came to how he understood policy? Like, what was his balance, I guess, between the theoretical and the practical?
It's a hard question to answer because his speeches are kind of all over the map in regard to ideology, was the term you used. At times, he does seem to be defending democracy as a principle against what he perceived as a autocratic monarchy, the regime of Philip. But at other times, he doesn't talk in those terms at all and talks in terms of the practical value to Athens of opposing Philip and the need to preserve its prosperity, its freedom, its economic life. So he takes different approaches in different speeches. He's not nearly as consistent as we might want him to be, but that's politics. He said what his audience wanted to hear.
Yeah, it was just striking to me, reading this overview of his life, the way in which he'll combine these highly ideological arguments, I guess, with passages that look like almost like they could be like from Xenophon's Poroi or something, with like, the really getting into the weeds about like, how are we going to pay for this? What are the numbers going to be? I mean, I guess maybe that's part of his sort of nerd reputation, is he's like a wonk still, even as he's advocating for certain policies and, I guess, national values.
That's right.
Well, when does he first speak out against Philip? Where do we get the first trace of Demosthenes addressing directly the threat of Philip in an assembly speech?
So that's the first Philippic. The term Philippic, obviously from Philip, is the title given to 4 orations that Demosthenes gave over a period of several years. The first one came in 351. And it's interesting that it's such a scorching attack on Philip right out of the blue, because in Demosthenes' previous speeches, he barely even mentioned Philip, and at one point mentions him only to show that he's not really interested in him at all. So he seems to have had an epiphany, perhaps, or else realized that this was the ticket to political prominence. In any case, he launched the Philippics in 351, and from that point onward, as his biographer Plutarch points out, he never let up. The rest of his political speeches up to Philip's death 15 years later are all about how to counter Philip.
Okay, well, maybe this brings us close then to the first big embassy to Macedon, and that Demosthenes himself, despite his very anti-Philippic sentiments, is a part of. Could you outline just what happens on this notorious embassy, or at the beginning of this series of embassies?
So we're at 346, a time when Philip was reaching out to Athens for a treaty, essentially a freeze in their respective military positions. Let's call a halt to hostilities and keep things in the status quo. Athens desired this because they felt that they needed time to build up their military forces if they were going to actually have a battle. And Philip, for various reasons, wanted a pause also. The embassy that you're speaking of was a group of 10 men appointed by Athens to go to Macedon and hammer out the terms of the treaty. Demosthenes was one of the 10, as was another man named Aeschines, and the two of them were the 2 junior members of the delegation. We have only Aeschines' report of what happened on the first meeting with Philip, and it's a very comical picture, and we don't know how well to trust it, because Aeschines turned out to be one of Demosthenes' worst political enemies. But according to Aeschines, Demosthenes, when it was his turn to speak, the very last of the 10, completely froze, couldn't get any words out at all, and even when Philip prompted him and encouraged him, give it another try, he still flubbed and floundered, and things had to be called off at that point.
Even Philip is like gives him a second chance because he like feels bad for him, according to Aeschines.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, this is a problem dealing with 4th century orators. They attack each other so vehemently and they make stuff up so easily, so shamelessly, that it's really hard to know what to believe. But we don't have an alternative version of these events from Demosthenes, so one has to think there's some truth to it. Otherwise, he would have countered it with his own version. But however that is, Demosthenes did not acquit himself well. The treaty was hammered out and brought back to Athens for approval. There's various comings and goings. There's 4 embassies altogether, so it's a complicated picture. But the long and short of it is that Athens felt it had been ripped off, that the treaty did not conform to what it had expected, and it was a bad deal. And Demosthenes promptly, catching the breeze, the shift in the political wind, accused Aeschines, the second youngest member of the delegation, of having taken bribes from Philip in order to make this treaty happen and give Athens the short end of the stick. And that resulted in the first legal showdown between these two great speakers, the question of the false embassy, as the Greek is usually translated, the parapresbeia of the treaty that's known today as the Peace of Philocrates.
Do we have any more sense of why Demosthenes would have gone from advocating amongst, with this group of 10, advocating for the adoption or the ratification or whatever of the treaty to then this position of saying, well, this was a bad deal that we got everybody to sign on to?
Well, as I say, he sensed that the tide was shifting and the tide of public opinion was going against the treaty, even though Athens had desired it initially. But Philip had managed to hoodwink Athens into giving up territory that it didn't think it was going to give up. And so the treaty no longer looked so good, only a few weeks after it had been signed. And so I think at that point, Demosthenes, fearing that he would be blamed if he didn't blame someone else, turned around and accused Aeschines of taking bribes.
Yeah, well, I guess too, maybe just because he was a junior member of the delegation, maybe he could sort of suggest that, it was everybody else, but me, like, that had the power within that delegation. And so it wasn't really his fault.
Exactly.
So could you say a little bit about the nature of the policy of containment vis-a-vis Macedon that Demosthenes ultimately was advocating over the scope of this period? I mean, what did he think should be done to counter the threat posed by Philip's mounting power?
So the big question was how great a threat Philip really was. It was clear he was impinging on Athenian interests in Thrace and the Chalcidice, the north of the Aegean. He actually had conquered places that were allied with Athens in that region. But there were some who argued that as long as he stays out of central Greece, stays north of the Pass of Thermopylae, he doesn't really threaten us that much. And sealing off the Pass of Thermopylae was an easy task for Athens, as we've seen, in other examples. The Spartans didn't quite seal it off in the time of the 300, but still, they had held off the Persians for several days. So Athens actually did close the pass at a time when Philip was trying to pass through and showed him that he couldn't enter central Greece unopposed, and Philip backed off. So it was possible to argue that Athens was safe as long as the Macedonians stayed in the north, and that made it hard for Demosthenes to get the kind of resources, the kind of commitment that he wanted to fighting Philip all over the map, even in Thrace and in the Chalcidice.
There's, at one point, Aeschines suggests that the war, the social war in Athens, that whereby, the Athens loses its the Second Athenian Confederacy, or whatever you want to call it, as its allies leave, is the same war, in a sense, as what's going on with Philip, that these are all kind of part of a wider conflict. Could you speak a little bit more about, what is the position of Athens in the mid-4th century within the Aegean world?
So Athens still had a tiny shred, a tiny vestige of its naval empire. It had several subjects/allies in the Eastern Aegean off the coast of what is now Turkey, and some were willing allies or subjects, and others had to be kept in line militarily. And as Athens applied more pressure, those allies revolted just as they had before in the 5th century, and Athens once again lost its naval possessions, its naval empire, such as it was. So Athenian power had been greatly reduced, and tribute money had been greatly reduced in the mid-5th century. Athens still had the dominant navy in the Aegean and could still exert enormous pressure, but who it could still control was very much a troubling question.
Right. So this was part of the problem that Demosthenes faced, right, is that for the Athenians, there seemed to be more immediate pressing problems. I mean, both, I guess, domestically with what's going on within the city and the city's own finances, and what's going on with the fragmentation and the departure of allies. I mean, that these were bigger problems than the distant Philip at first. I mean, is that a fair characterization of the kind of opposition that he encountered?
Yes. There was a faction at Athens, just as there is, in many countries today, that argued we can't afford all these commitments. Our revenue is not what it was. Warships are very expensive. We can only defend essential interests, not luxury interests. And so the policies that Demosthenes was advocating, confrontation of Philip in the north, were very expensive. And he did not succeed in convincing the assembly to tap various funds that were not set aside for military use them for military purposes, and mount a much bigger force than they, in fact, advocated.
So what was it then that finally really got the Athenians to notice? How did it come to be that Philip seemed to be sort of just on the brink of actually marching on Athens?
So a series of events in 340, 339 BC, when Philip had been on the march for almost 2 decades, convinced Athens that its lifeline was really at stake. First, there were moves by Philip against the cities on the Hellespont, the waterway by which Athens received most of its food shipments. So, as your listeners may know, Athens was starved into defeat in the Peloponnesian War when the Spartans got control of that waterway. Now Philip seemed to be trying the same strategy. That failed, but soon thereafter, he did succeed in getting through the pass of Thermopylae, occupied a city in central Greece, from which it was a fairly easy march, first to Thebes, the first major Greek city he would encounter, the city of central Greece, that is, and then Athens soon thereafter. So once that happened, the news was brought to Athens, and it was clearly a crisis. An emergency assembly was called, and Demosthenes finally got the war that he had been seeking for the past 12 years.
Yeah, and what was his role in particular in bringing Thebes, a sort of unlikely ally, into alliance with Athens in order to confront Philip?
There's evidence in a couple of speeches of Aeschines that Demosthenes was a kind of a Theban intermediary, what the Greeks called a proxenos, someone representing Theban interests in Athens. We don't know for sure that that was the case. The Athenians at this stage of their history did not like Thebes much at all, and so to link your opponent to Thebes was a way to put him in a bad light. But Demosthenes seems to have at least had a neutral opinion about Thebes and to recognize that they were the best hope for Athens of resistance to Philip, that a Theban alliance with Athens could counter the huge Macedonian army, could equal its numbers and possibly even its military experience, and get Philip back out of central Greece, send him back to the north.
So how did the clash that everybody had kind of been waiting for, how did that come about in 338?
So Demosthenes pulled off the alliance with Thebes, got the two cities to take the field together in a place called Chaeronea in Boeotia, and the two together must have fielded about 35,000 infantry and cavalry, more than the Macedonians had, but less experienced, less well-equipped. But nevertheless, the two sides were evenly matched in numbers. And that was really the biggest battle that Central Greece had seen, at least since the time of the Persian Wars.
So, of course, there's the famous defeat of the Greek alliance at Chaeronea, the destruction of the sacred band, supposedly, which you've written about elsewhere as well. I guess I'm most curious about later on Aeschines and on the crown. He'll say, because as you write about in your Demosthenes biography, Demosthenes is chosen to give the funeral oration over the dead of Chaeronea. So he gets that honor. And Aeschines says, this was a really grim, sad irony that Demosthenes should have been chosen to give that funeral oration when he was the one who was responsible for all of those deaths. What did he mean by that? Why was there an opinion out there that it was actually Demosthenes' policy that had caused this, when he had pretty clearly been advocating for earlier containment of Philip?
So the Athenians, when they realized Philip was on their doorstep, they had a difficult choice to make, as did the Thebans. Either city could have easily decided to collaborate with Philip. And there was a sizable faction at Athens that thought that was a good idea. The Philippizers, as Demosthenes called them. Philip seemed to be offering them very favorable treatment and partnership in a growing, expanding empire, and the chance to march against the great king in Asia and steal a lot of his wealth. So I can see that the temptation on both the Athenian and Theban side was quite strong to simply partner with Philip rather than resist him. Demosthenes was the one who, according to his own account, stepped forward in the assembly and insisted on resistance, not collaboration.
Well, one of the points that you make in the biography is that in that funeral oration, despite it being a very solemn occasion and despite his speech having many of the characteristics of the Athenian funeral oration, that he does start defending his policies, taking some digs at those who oppose him. I mean, what is striking about Demosthenes' funeral oration for the dead of Chaeronea?
Well, it's a stirring speech, as all funeral orations have to be. They tug at the heartstrings and they summon ideals of Athenian patriotism, the glory of the resistance to Persia, the need to die on behalf of freedom, to preserve freedom. But along the way, and this is the complexity of Demosthenes, he's capable of soaring, eloquent, stirring rhetoric, and then below-the-belt jabs at his opponents. So along the way, he mentions that the battle might have gone differently if not for those Theban generals who didn't know what they were doing, and therefore it's really not his fault, it's not Demosthenes' fault that Athens lost.
Yeah, he starts to develop this notion that's pretty new for the funeral orations of just bad luck. Right?
Yes.
I mean, that, yeah, why? So what is his, kind of after the fact, what is his own take on his own policies? I mean, is he just completely doubled down? Do we ever get a glimpse anywhere of Demosthenes suggesting that he thought he might have been a little bit wrong about anything? Or is it just kind of all I told you so and I was always advocating the right thing?
He doesn't seem to have ever said a mea culpa. He's aware that he's being blamed, and especially in his speech on the crown, which I don't know, you may want to get to later, but he defends himself in numerous speeches using this concept of bad luck. The battle was a good battle. It was right to fight it. It just happened to go badly. He compares himself to the captain of a ship who's done everything right. He's ensured the safety of the sails, the rigging, the hull, but the storm that came along while he was out at sea turned out to be a massive storm that no one could have predicted. Those things happen, essentially, is what he's saying. And fate was in charge, not me.
So what happens to him in the immediate aftermath of Chaironeia? I mean, okay, well, he's selected to give the funeral oration. But after that, I mean, for kind of a couple of years, he sort of goes a little bit under the radar.
Right. Philip was killed 2 years after Chaironeia, and Alexander took his place. And Demosthenes, at that point, thinking Alexander was a nobody, or was a non-entity, instigated and aided rebellion by Thebes against the Macedonian Empire. That turned out to be a even worse debacle than Chaironeia. The Thebans didn't get help from Athens that they were counting on and were annihilated, the entire city destroyed by Alexander in retribution for their revolt. So Demosthenes now has two big losses on his record, right? Chaironeia and Thebes, both of which he had pushed hard to get rolling. So from that point onward, as you said, he becomes a much less pronounced voice in the assembly. At least we have no speeches from the mid-330s all the way down to really the end of his life. He seems to have taken a backseat in politics.
Yeah, he kind of seems to be lying low for a little bit. I mean, which maybe it was a smart thing to do. But I think this would be a good time to talk about all this business about crowns, which never were awarded without controversy in the case of Demosthenes. So what is this business with Athenian crowns anyways? Could you say a little bit about that and about why Demosthenes would have had motions to award them to him? I mean, 3 times over the course of a decade or so.
Yeah, so a gold crown in this context is not a mark of royalty. It's a public accolade awarded by the city to its benefactors, people who have done it good service. And Demosthenes received more than one, as you say, and the third that was proposed for him was in 330, after these two debacles, Chaironeia and Thebes. And it's clearly an effort by his supporters to rehabilitate his reputation, to point out that he's done the city a lot of good, even if these episodes went badly. But Aeschines, his old foe, still unreconciled, went back into the fray and brought a motion against the man who proposed the crown, saying this was an illegal motion, and that led to the trial of the century, as I call it, in which Demosthenes delivered his most famous speech on the crown.
In the other cases of the crowns that had been proposed and awarded to Demosthenes, one I think by his cousin Demomeles, which I think is kind of funny as a name. So Demomeles for Demosthenes. But in these earlier cases, one by Demomeles, one by Hyperides, they had been challenged before.
Mm-hmm.
So to what extent do you think that when Ctesiphon moved these honors for Demosthenes, that everybody knew that somebody would challenge them and that this was a kind of bait for someone, Aeschines maybe, or someone else in a faction against Demosthenes, that it was bait for someone to respond with a charge of a illegal proposal, graphe paranomon, to give Demosthenes a chance to to stand up and make it a kind of apologia. To what extent do you think that might have been the case?
That's an interesting theory. I've never thought of it that way, but that's entirely possible that things were engineered so as to produce a trial of the century and enable Demosthenes to make his case. I don't know that we can know that.
Well, how unusual is it that Demosthenes spoke on behalf of Ctesiphon in this case? Do you think that that's something that people would have expected if the accusation was against the proposer of the crown, but Demosthenes steps in and says, "Well, I'm going to speak here"? Was that a usual thing to happen, or?
It was not uncommon, but as to whether it was expected, I don't know. Yeah, any defendant had the right to yield his time, as it were, to an advocate, a speechwriter, or a defender. And in this case, the defendant, Ctesiphon, yielded his time to Demosthenes.
So what was the nature of that trial? First of all, what do you think was the atmosphere? I mean, you sketch it a little bit in the book, but maybe you could just describe for listeners. You call it the trial of the century. In what ways was that the case?
Well, Aeschines claims that the majority of the city was present as spectators, either as jurors, and the jury was enormous, I think over 1,000, and then as onlookers outside the court precincts proper, but able to see and hear what was taking place. So let's say, I mean, he's exaggerating when he says the majority, but let's say there were thousands of people present, and possibly the educated elite of the city, because everyone knew these two orators were going to pull out all the stops and deliver their top-notch rhetoric in the service of this trial. So it had a huge audience, and what was at stake, because the crown was awarded for public service over the course of a career, not for any particular benefaction, but for a whole career. So what was at stake was really Demosthenes' whole standing as a public servant. Had he done the city good or not? And that was a question on which Athenians were divided.
Well, so ultimately he wins, and the story goes, right, that Aeschines didn't even get enough votes or he got so few votes that Aeschines himself basically had to leave Athens in embarrassment and humiliation. But how does it then go from Demosthenes having acquitted himself, Ctesiphon sort of having defended successfully by one metric his reputation, to eventually being exiled himself by the Athenians? What are the sort of fortunes of his reputation in Athens between the crown trial and for the next 7 years or so until the end of his life?
So we know very little about Demosthenes in the 320s. Now we're down to the 320s. Demosthenes is in his 50s and has mostly fallen silent from what we know, at least in the assembly. He's still writing court speeches. But politics had become a much less volatile affair because Alexander was in charge and calling the tune, and no one wanted to go up against him, especially after the destruction of Thebes. But Athens was faced with a very difficult situation in 324 when a refugee, a kind of rogue officer from the Macedonian army, arrived at their doorstep, wanting sanctuary, wanting asylum, and bringing with him a huge amount of money that he'd stolen basically from Alexander, 700 talents, which is enormous sum. And Athens at first turned him away, thinking we don't want to anger the Macedonians more than we have to. But in a second appeal, they admitted him, but confiscated the money, put it in escrow where it will be safe so that it could be returned to Alexander someday. But there are a lot of buts here. The money, when it was examined later, proved to be only half of what had been placed there. Who took the other half? The Athenians were tearing their hair out trying to figure this out because someone had to take the blame if a lot of Alexander's money was missing. After 6 months of deliberation by an investigative body, Demosthenes was charged, along with several others, of having taken pieces of this money. What the evidence was is very unclear. I don't think there was any, frankly. But the politics of the time were such that that Athens had something to gain from putting Demosthenes in the wrong and rejecting him in order to gain favor with Alexander.
Who had wanted his head before.
Who had wanted his head before and had been frustrated and clearly now would be very pleased to have him out of Athens or even dead. So I think he was scapegoated by a body that saw an advantage in making him persona non grata.
So ultimately, how would you characterize his reputation? Because it seems to be characterized by a lot of sort of ups and downs. I mean, eventually he gets remembered as this incredible dogged advocate for Greek freedom, but it's not that simple in terms of the 4th century. What is the evolution of his reputation?
You're right. He took a roller coaster ride. He was up and down several times, and finally down because in the era of the after the death of Alexander, the city fell into the hands of another Macedonian warlord, and he's the subject of my first biography for the Yale series, Demetrius.
Right.
Of Demetrius Poliorketes, the sacker of cities. And democracy was very much on the outs. And Demosthenes, as his champion, was on the outs. But over time, the Athenians came to regret having booted him out, having cast him into the dust, and they rehabilitated him and put up a statue, the famous statue of which we have several Roman copies, a magnificent portrait, I think, showing him as an earnest statesman carrying a scroll in his hands, going to the assembly to make a speech, and with a look of intense concern on his face. So that statue went up in the Agora, the Athenian marketplace, and Demosthenes was considered a hero.
Having spent so much time with the sources and having, told us that part of the idea behind the Ancient Lives series for Yale is to think about the inner life of the subjects of these biographies. What is the sense that you gained of Demosthenes, the man, of his inner life, of his personality and character?
Well, the phrase that I love to use in this context is human, all too human. He's a very real person, he's in 3 dimensions, in flesh and blood. He's not always likable. He says some absolutely detestable things in some of his attacks on Aeschines, makes things up out of thin air, flings barbs with wild abandon. At his heart, he was a patriot and a defender of democracy. The subtitle of my book is Democracy's Defender, and believed Athenian freedom was the paramount cause of the Greek world. And for that, I admire him. On balance, I find him to be an admirable figure.
Well, can I ask, in terms of projects, what's next for you?
So I have a book coming out. I should say that, the book that is most current for me is called Plato and the Tyrant, a study of Plato's adventure in Syracuse, his misadventure, I should say, with the tyrant Dionysius the Younger. But in May, getting away from history for the first time in a long time, I have a collection of short quotes from Greek tragedy, from the lost Greek plays, collected by Stobaeus, the man who anthologized a lot of classical literature as a way to educate his son in moral principles. And so the book is called Since You're Mortal, Life Lessons from the Lost Greek Plays. And that will come out from Norton in May.
Oh, that's great. We'll look forward to that. The last question I have is that I ask every guest on this podcast. I mean, times are a little bit strange and difficult lately. And what is something that you have been doing lately, reading, watching, listening to, otherwise doing, that has been bringing you some joy? Given
that I love to find these roots into the consciousness of people of the time. I've been reading diaries from historical crises. The Berlin diary of William Scherer in the 1930s from Nazi Germany. And now I'm reading something called Company H, which I learned about from an interview in the New York Times Book Review that is a marvelous firsthand account from a Civil War Confederate soldier of the great battles of the Civil War. And first-person writing, eyewitness writing is just the best way to experience history. We have that from Demosthenes, luckily, and from a few other people, not many, but where we can find them, that's my greatest pleasure.
Well, thanks, James. Thank you so much for joining me here on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.